right, folks, it looks like we've got some people starting to trickle in. We'll give everybody just a minute or two to get situated. Just as a reminder for anyone who's done these before or for anyone who is new to Zoom webinars, if you have any questions at all, you can hit the chat or Q&A buttons at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll get to those as they come up. Again, just going to let a few people come in, and while folks are getting seated, I wanted to thank Integrative Life Center. These webinars are hosted by Integrative Life Center through the online network of resources for clinicians that's called Integrative Life Network. You can visit either Integrative Life Center for more information on all of the programs, team, and treatment philosophies, or you can go to integrativelifenetwork.com just as a direct link to the full catalog of resources that are available to you. And again, we'll let everybody get situated for just another minute here. And looks like we're got just about everybody coming in. So thank you to Carrie Ishee, first of all, for being with us today. Carrie is here to talk about her memoir that chronicles the traumatic experience of psychological abduction and sexual exploitation by her therapist, Dr. Anthony Romano. Dr. Romano was 31 years her senior, and for around 3 years, what we would say is an affair was actually a very calculated and controlling situation where Romano put Carrie in a position where she felt very much like this was a developing relationship, and he was really taking advantage of her and her emotional state as a part of that relationship. The relationship finally came to light when Carrie's suicide attempts landed her in the hospital. And as she gradually began to reclaim her power, was able to report Romano to the state licensing board and did successfully sue him for malpractice, and ultimately ended up testifying before state legislature just to bring awareness to these kind of abuses. So Carrie, as she's telling her tale today, I think this is something really compelling that we can all learn from, either on the client side or on the therapist side. But you'll notice that it's a journey that parallels the mythical archetype of Persephone, who is the naive innocent who was abducted into darkness and then reemerged and regenerated herself, and then ultimately returned fearlessly to the prison she'd fled to help free others. Today, Carrie Ishee is a respected art therapist, a clinical counselor, and life coach, and also a teacher specializing in the issue of ethics, self-care, and boundaries for mental health professors. She's also an adjunct faculty member at Southwestern College in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And this is where she teaches addictions, treatment, and assessment in art therapy. She also occasionally presents for the Transformational Healing Conference hosted by SWC, and is an APSATS trained therapist with extensive experience in working with partners and sex addicts. So Carrie, again, so happy to have you here. I think this is such an important conversation. Just so everybody knows, the title of Carrie's book is Seduced into Darkness, and I will drop a link right into our chat so that folks can pick up a copy. I highly recommend it. Carrie, I gave some of the highlights, but would you mind telling us a bit about yourself?
Sure thing. What a great introduction, first of all. Well, so I am an art therapist and a clinical counselor and a life coach here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And this journey that I went on started when I was just shy of 21, when I started having an immune system breakdown from being on antibiotics for 4 years for my skin, which is back in the 70s, the antibiotics were given like candy, essentially. They were not very well regulated. I just wanted my acne to clear up. So I was on this medication for 4 years. And by the time between my junior and senior year in college, I started having immune system breakdown. I was having foggy brains and was lethargic. And then soon thereafter, I started having panic attacks and really crippling depression, where it was hard for me to get out of bed in the morning. Started having a bit of a spiritual awakening as my mom invited me to start attending prayer meetings with her. And I would go back and forth from my college, which was about 5 hours away, and my parental home, and was having also sort of the spiritual awakening of thinking, oh wow, there really is a creator, a divine presence. I'd been raised Catholic, which had been very heady, even though it was mystical at times. So I was having this awakening at the same time, and some literature calls this like a spiritual emergency. Clearly, there were physiological things going on. I was about to graduate from college in the next year in 1980, when women were just starting to come into the workforce, or 1981, I guess it was. So there were a lot of factors that happened, but my parents are like, come home. One of the doctors down at my college wanted to put me on medication, and they're like, come home, let's get some consultations. So they lined up a number, and I wound up in the office of Dr. Anthony Romano, whose name I changed, by the way. That's not his name. And I did that to protect his family and not to be worried about calls in the middle of the night from from his family, right? So
Understandable.
yeah. So anyway, so I was riveted by this process of someone listening so deeply to me. I'd been raised Catholic and in a military family, and there wasn't a lot of internal reflection. There was a lot of love, but it was all kind of ritualized in tradition, right? And to have this powerful Georgetown educated man listening to me so deeply, I just felt like my world was really opening up. And he was getting fascinated by these spiritual experiences I was having. And I was feeling this conflict between psychotherapy and spirituality. And I was like, I've got to somehow blend these, because back in the 80s, they were very far apart. You didn't have any of the Buddhist mindfulness practices. In fact, most of the early 80s, it was very Freudian influenced, right? There wasn't a lot of discussion about spirituality. And I was really feeling conflict inside about this. And he started getting fascinated by this and saying, if you ever go to one of these services, let me know, I'll come with you. And so there's a lot of aspects of this, but long story short, there was this blended, the boundaries started getting violated. He started getting more and more intrigued. And I was feeling like kind of on a spiritual high that this powerful man thought I was so interesting. But at the same time, like, this doesn't feel right. And he was in the process of kind of whittling away my boundaries with my family. From the very beginning was saying, it seems like you're uncomfortable with your sexuality, which was not something I brought in. That was not my agenda. I was in a crisis, and I was also feeling like, wow, why can't I find a guy that I want to marry? I'm like 21, right? Which again, though, different generation, right? The women married early, and my sister did. And I was like, what's wrong with me that I can't make a commitment? Which he just milked. A healthy therapist would say, you're 21, go learn about life. It's okay, right? But he really supported me pathologizing myself. So long story short, I started getting more and more off track with my own intuition. And at one point in time, and he offered to pay for my graduate program. He said, you're so smart, you'd be a great therapist. My corporation will pay for your education. So there were all these ways in which he was just luring me in. Grooming is another way to put it.
Yeah.
And yeah.
That sounds, like you presented him with a lot of vulnerability, and instead of, using that as an avenue to help you heal and discover more about yourself, he really latched onto that for his own purposes. Sounds pretty like it was pretty quickly.
I would say from the beginning, he started, it was like the third session or something when my parents had come in for a consultation, and he encouraged me to leave college, to come home and work with him, which coming home and living with my parents at age 21, when I only had a year to graduate, not even a year, like 6 months, was excruciating. I felt humiliated that I couldn't function, right? And so, but we were like, you follow the doctor's orders, right? You take antibiotics for your skin, and so there really wasn't much dialogue about that. I was in crisis, so I definitely needed help. But leaving college and coming home, I was trying to do my process work while living with my family, when I felt humiliated being back home at 21. And all of my friends were gone from town. And then I was away from my college friends. So I was like a sitting duck. I was so vulnerable.
So, and this is, my first question, and I know that we've got a lot of good stuff to talk about. This is to me, it seems like a very personal and potentially, extremely painful story to tell people. So I'm curious how you got to a point where you felt like you could write about it and you could put it out in the world and use it as something to help other people, kind of start their healing process or feel less alone.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I really felt, so very long story short, when all of this all came to light after I made a couple of serious suicide attempts. And I had been in a doctor, by this time I was in a doctoral program in clinical psychology and had to leave the profession that I had worked so hard to get into. And I was sort of like this idea that I was going to die with this secret. I didn't want him to get in trouble. And I was thinking, oh, I'm just so screwed up. It's me, I'm screwed up. And I was in the hospital. As I was getting ready to discharge from the second hospital, I was there for 6 months. It was Shepherd Pratt in Maryland. I was transferred to, during which time I was encouraged to take action against him. I was given the name of the attorney from the treatment team. I mean, it was very mind-bending experience to have that happen, but they were just like, you need to take action. And so there was a lot that happened in the hospital, but I remember as I was getting ready to leave, I was like, oh my God, I have to tell not just my story, I have to tell the tale, I'm gonna cry, of the people in the underworld. Because the souls that I met in the hospital, from the inside the hospital versus if I would have looked at it, from the outside, I was so compelled by them, by their stories, by the healing I was having, see happen. And back in the 80s, there weren't treatment centers like ILC or the Meadows or any of the big places that we think of now that are wonderful and holistic. These were psychiatric hospitals, and I had attempted suicide, so I needed to be safe. So anyway, I remember sitting there drinking my coffee going, I'm going to write this story one day. And I still get emotional about it because it was like, whoa, how did this happen? I needed to put the pieces together to see what had happened to me, but I also wanted to bring to light, because back when I went through what I went through, I was never told I had PTSD. It was later through my own exploration that I found that out. That's how long ago this was. In the DSM, we've come so far in trauma treatment. So it was like, I had this feeling of like, wow, it's not that these people are screwed up. We have to look at what happened to them. And, there were just so many abuse survivors, which now we take for granted. But back in then, it was still like there's the mentally ill and the mentally well. And it was very stigmatized. And so I just felt this call, not just for myself, but for other people that had gone through hardship and hardship and wound up in hospital.
It sounds like it was a pretty powerful call. And I'd love to kind of talk about how that call relates to, you called it the underworld, right? All of these people who are in the underworld together. I'd love to know more about kind of how you found the Persephone myth as something that you related to and that was healing. And just would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Would love to, because that was very, very powerful for me. When I felt the really strong call back in 2011, throughout the years, now I'm 61, I was 21 when this happened. So this is 40-year arc, okay? My daughter was just going into middle school and was getting a life outside of our home. And so I had some space to really listen in of like, what are my next steps? And at that time, I had left being a trauma therapist for a while and was just doing coaching. And it was before I got called back to Life Healing Center, where I went back in as an art therapist. But anyway, I had this strong call. I went out under the New Mexico night with the glorious stars, and I had this feeling of like, now is the time. And so I went and I met with a friend of mine who's a mythology expert, evolutionary astrologer, psychotherapist. And I was telling him about this and this call that I had. And some of it, I just needed support, right? This was a big thing to come forward with. And he said, yours is the story of Persephone. And when he said that, it was like the air crackled around me, and it gave me this archetypal mythological context within which to put my story. Because I was quite frankly pretty sick of my story. I was really relieved to hear a goddess from the pantheon had gone through something like this. And I actually think the story of Persephone is something we all can touch on, men and women. of being seized, abducted into an underworld experience. And that could be, violence, that could be war, that could be a car accident, that could be something that rips you out of what you knew, and you're in the dark and you can't find a light. And in the Persephone myth, she is the young maiden who gets abducted by Hades, who is god of the underworld, also her uncle, or lord of the underworld. And so it's an incestuous kind of experience where he holds her hostage. But in the process of being there in the underworld, she adjusts. It's almost like she has eyes in the dark. And then later, as she regenerates herself and is rescued and comes back out, she's the goddess of spring, which shows like the potential for renewal. But she's also the queen of the underworld, guiding lost souls through their journeys. So there was something about that that just felt really, really inspiring to me. And I would tap into the wisdom of that myth. And again, it just felt like when we have these huge things that happen that are mind bending, I was so shattered and blown apart. Everything I knew was gone, right? My relationships with my family, my health, my career. I'm in a hospital now. I didn't find out about the Persephone myth till later, but it really made me go, okay, I can do this. This is not just about me. I didn't want it to be just about me, even though it is my story.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think really resonates for me when you just said, not just wanting it to be about you, even though it's your story. And so it sounds like, there have probably been a number of points that were really pivotal in, okay, I need to tell my story. Okay, this is not just about telling my own story, it's about other people. What were some of the other things that you think were really key in, one, helping you tell your story, and two, that continued journey of healing in that Persephonic cycle of, okay, I am in darkness and now I'm in light, and now I have some control over how I move through the darkness that kind of keeps going.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I think, and you might see, I don't know if people can see the artwork behind me here. A couple of these are my pieces. Behind one is Kandinsky's, a piece by Kandinsky, and he was a real source of inspiration to me. And art was huge for me, and I discovered that in the hospital. And I had already had an artistic flair that went more through like the way that I dressed or interior decorating. But I felt this like push pull. I didn't get a lot of artistic training. So it was when it burst forth. Now I could read an aspect of my book if you'd like, that kind of
That would
conveys.
be terrific. Yeah.
Okay. It's just a couple of pages. So because I think it's really powerful in terms of well, we know, and which is exciting. This is an exciting time to do trauma work because there is so much more focus on the somatic, the creative expressive, the right brain kinds of modalities. That again, back in the 80s, art therapy was an adjunct piece. Fortunately, it was there for me. So I had just done this piece in art therapy, and I was down, we were like talking, in the basement of the psychiatric hospital, and there were like 12 other, my compadres in the underworld, all trying to find ourselves again. And I put this image up, and I was getting a lot of feedback of, wow, that's really creative. And so I'm just going to read now. Something unfamiliar quivered inside me. It took me a few seconds to recognize that it was a feeling of happiness. I thought back to the zany sense of humor I'd had in my teens and how my friends and I would laugh joyously at the absurdities of life. Was it coming back? I can tell you're creative and very resourceful, Audrey, the art therapist continued. Sitting there in our art review session, again, we were all looking at our artwork up on the wall, I began to see where my creativity and resourcefulness, my strengths, had helped me survive a severe depression and a poisonous relationship with my psychiatrist. It was a damned revelation. I sat up straighter. That night, I lay awake in bed with the door open, listening to the night staff whisper in the halls. I couldn't stop thinking about the creative energy from another realm that had poured into me in art class. She or it had wanted to reach out and to be part of me again. I'm probably going to cry. The connection, whew, I can still feel it. It was like whoosh. This connection to my higher self felt more real and important than the suicide attempts, psychiatric commitments, lawsuits, or despicable shrinks. Through my bedroom window, I noticed that the moon was brighter than usual. Maybe there was hope for me.
Mystic and psychiatrist Carl Jung said the psyche speaks to us through symbols rather than words. Here I'd verbally rehash my ordeal 100 times over, but never once had I given myself credit for surviving it. The drawing helped me do that. I couldn't wait to go back to the studio. If I had my way, I'd be there every day, every hour, painting away all the remnants of my madness. I wanted to go as often as possible so I could expel every last drop of angst. I wanted to be done with all the mud, the monsters, the ugliness and trauma, and was eager to put them where they belonged, on paper or canvas, releasing them from my heart and mind. After painting and sketching for a few weeks, I continued to unearth more and more positive aspects of myself, which I could nurture and trust. One day in art therapy, I felt extremely lighthearted and found it easier than usual to draw. I grabbed some colored chalk and made a quick, simple drawing of abstract shapes on red paper. I tacked it on the board and headed back to my seat. Holy shit, said Richard, a wonderful gay man recovering from the heartbreak of losing his partner. He stared transfixed. My God, Carrie, another voice rang out. Others in the room gasped. Someone whispered, Jesus, Carrie. I spun around and took in the image from a distance. I froze. I hadn't really seen it before. Dozens of jagged penis-shaped parts were pointing inward from all directions, stabbing in a void in the center. Dark shades of red, blue, and black pulsated with pain. A wave of nausea washed over me as I realized that this drawing of mine was telling a story of repeated psychic rape. Audrey addressed the shock in the room. Do you want to tell us about your image, Carrie? I answered in an unnatural monotone. I guess I was abused by my shrink. Those who were still working popped up their heads from their unfinished pieces, and for a few minutes, we just sat there examining what had sprung out of me. All were quiet. I fled the studio and practically ran back to my room, not caring that I was being followed by a staff member. I had to be with someone at all time at that point. I felt as if a dam built of numbness, rationalization, and denial had been holding back my grief, but now it crumbled irrevocably. A flood of sorrow and betrayal surged forth, drowning me. My entire body heaved with deep, urgent sobs. The door flew open and a nurse reminded me I wasn't allowed to shut it. I collapsed on the floor behind the bed in an effort to gain some privacy. The flood washed away my self-blame, my misconceptions. I had been emotionally and spiritually violated and psychically shattered, abused by a man I had trusted, a doctor my parents had paid to heal me, a mentor with whom I had shared my deepest spiritual yearnings and dreams of a beautiful life, a person whom I had believed to be a father figure, a healer, my closest friend. I couldn't condone Tony's behavior any longer. It had almost killed me. My body convulsed and I cried myself to sleep. So that was a huge turning point of breaking down the denial. And yeah.
Wow, that's very striking and very powerful. And I just keep thinking about how you reached this moment that was so light. You had rediscovered this kind of passion and strength inside of yourself, and you're putting it into the world in the form of this artwork, and it's very beautiful, and it brings you to this almost point of elation. And then there's the realization, right? That kind of snap moment of, okay, now you have discovered your power again to some extent, and you're seeing yourself more clearly. And so now here is the moment itself. Yeah. Here is this conglomeration of all these things that were not your fault and that impacted you so deeply, and that must have been indescribable to some extent, just that level of everything.
Yeah, well, totally. And I think that's the moment, like the trauma bond with him broke.
Yeah.
It was a trauma bond. It was the betrayal of the trust. I was holding that at bay, even when I had dozens of people by this time in the 2 different hospitals I had been in say, this was wrong. He abused you. I was like, no, he loved me. I was holding on to that so tightly. But then when this image poured out of my deepest self, it changed everything. And I think you're very perceptive, Annie, with just that piece about Annie, I'm sorry, that I don't know that would have happened until I had started to connect with my own creative resources. It was like there had been a bridge back to my old self, my higher self, really. that then allowed this material to come forward. And I was so unaware when I did it. That's what was remarkable. That's where, Jung talks about the, psyche speaking more powerfully in images than words. And it was, boy, did that just come through like a freight train. And by that time I had been being encouraged to take him to court. And I was like, really ambivalent. I mean, for my own survival, I certainly was considering it, but it took that image coming forward. It was a pivotal image. And so it's part of why I became an art therapist too, is that when you've been violated by someone that you trusted so much, it was really hard for me to trust any healthcare professionals you can imagine, anybody really, especially myself. But the art allowed a pathway back to trusting myself and my own instincts. And I still to this day doodle and get stuff out when I feel any kind of contraction inside. So really, Bessel van der Kolk has the book, The Body Keeps the Score. And so creating images from the body and what comes out is a very powerful medicine for people that are in denial.
So would you mind if we pivot just a little bit, because that seems like it was such a powerful moment in you being able to reclaim some of yourself. And I will, as a side note, say I was thinking about when you said, that return to higher self. In mythology, in history, in so many things, when you want to see better, you go to higher ground so that you can see more clearly all the way around you. And as you started to see more clearly what the relationship that really your therapist had created with you had not just fostered, but had
orchestrated.
Yes, orchestrated is the right word there. And you made this very brave decision to try and get the right thing done, to take him to court, to do these things. And if this is a poorly worded question, please forgive me, but how, because we're talking to other therapists, and I think that as we're talking about boundaries and so on, can you tell me a little bit about where you think he was, as a mental health professional, as somebody who has committed, as well as any other health professional, to do no harm, to help people, where do you think he was? And to some extent, I think I'm also asking, how do you think that other therapists can avoid putting themselves in that position? I think you and I had a chance to talk a little bit before this, and we talked a bit about boundaries and about how there are, those extreme boundaries, those sexual relationships, those things, but there are also smaller things where, it's the first step towards, okay, I've blurred this boundary, which will make it easier to blur the next boundary.
Sure. Well, I think, first of all, back in the 80s, there was still a lot of that kind of patriarchal model of, and Freudian oriented psychoanalytic therapy, that so much of the healing was supposed to happen in this one relationship, right? I think that created a very powerful, that's supposed to be a sacred vessel, but we're also human. And if you've got the therapist that's there with unmet needs themselves, which, we obviously get some needs met being therapist, purpose, seeing people grow and all that. But if we start to find that we're, cutting off avenues of creating a whole life and getting our needs met so much in the therapy room, we have already put ourselves in a more vulnerable place. The research, and there's a lot of different studies on this, but you and I talked about this the other day, was that that interestingly enough, these are not typically novice therapists. These tend to be older, mature, having been in the profession for decades. Now, there are the serial predators that may start from the start, start from the very beginning of their profession, looking for the vulnerable, but that's not that often. But instead, it's someone that gets somewhat complacent. They think they've got it down. Maybe they're not doing their CEUs classes anymore. He had started to fudge on his CEU stuff. He was not active in his profession. And so I also think that he was, later on, it was so interesting to be called in, requested to come back to Life Healing Center and start working with sex addicts. Because after about 6 months back there, and this was really being worked in early 2011, I was like, oh my God, I think he was a sex addict. There's a type of Carnes
in his typology, the exploitive sex, where someone really gets off from being, the in power and exploiting the vulnerable. So I think that was going on with him. I think there was an arrogance, like he had already done this. He knew the rules didn't apply to him. So interestingly enough, again, the studies show more often there's like a 20, 25 year age difference between the client and the doctor, patient and the doctor, more predominantly older man, younger woman, but not always. It can be any configuration. But one of the things I feel passionate about is, first of all, I think we're in an exciting time where we can refer as therapists ourselves, we can refer our clients to a lot of resources besides just us. I think if we ever start to think we're the one who has to save, it's got to come through us, we're already taking on more than is necessary, and we could be undermining the client's authority, the client's own process. So I think creating beautiful lives, continuing to be in self-care, and part of, again, another reason why I wrote this book, particularly around not just what goes on with people in the underworld, but my own story, is that I think there needs to be more active dialogue about how powerful the sacred vessel of therapy is, and that we're human, and that we need to be having conversations. We take these ethics classes, but they're often very stale. You reread the code of ethics, you look at a couple of case studies, they're not like enlivened in terms of where have you looked to get your needs met, and like a real serious inquiry, a humble self-inquiry. And, I think that the whole medical model, which a lot of the obviously psychiatrists come through, less so than master's levels therapists, art therapists, whatnot. It's like, you're the expert. You're supposed to figure this out, diagnose and fix, right? That's such a setup, because this is soul work. And so I think whenever we think we're the expert and we're not allowing ourselves to be humbled and giving the power back to the client, we're already compromising the situation. And yet it's so human. We need to keep being in self-inquiry. We need to keep dialoguing, looking at ourselves. So that was a long-winded answer.
No, that really does help a lot. When you were talking about folks who tend to perpetrate these inappropriate relationships with people tend to be further along in their career. They tend to be established. They're not newer, and they're not doing all of their CEUs and these kind of things. It made me think about and I need to validate this at some point, but I had a friend who was in the military tell me once that they talk about the 200-hour rule, and it relates to fighter pilots, where once they hit over 200 hours of flying time, they'll sometimes start to make what seem like really small mistakes. They stop running through the entire checklist. They stop because they think that, I've been doing this, and this is muscle memory. I've got this. I don't need to worry so much. Like, I'm just going to fly this plane because I know what I'm doing. And it made me think about and that's very dangerous, right? For one person or many, depending on the outcome there. And that made me really think about, in terms of anyone who is a steward of another person in some way, medical doctors, anybody who is working to help people heal, that's such a tremendous amount of responsibility. And it would be very dangerous to get cocky about that, to think, I've been doing this for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. I don't need to go to this training, or I don't need to do as much rigorous self-examination as maybe when I was younger. So I really appreciate your perspective on that. And I think, we had some questions that folks submitted with their webinar sign up. And one of those was around, what are some of those warning signs that you can look for with colleagues or just with providers in general? Like, what can people be on the lookout for? And not even just in a matter of, okay, hey, I know for sure somebody is absolutely abusing someone, but how, as a colleague or a friend, can you say, hey, I'm concerned about this behavior and that it might be taking you in the wrong direction?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And it's very tricky, right? It's tricky to open a conversation if you have a colleague or a friend that you see you question their own life balance, right? I think, gosh, that's such a big question, how to answer it. I think if you see someone getting more and more isolated in their life, where they're really not creating a life besides the 30 clients they're seeing or whatever, right? That they seem to be losing, it's like their whole identity is their profession. I think in any profession we're in, that sets us up. We're vulnerable, right? So that would be a piece, like just seeing someone, or if they seem obsessive about a particular client. And again, not likely that they're going to share that, but if they do share it, in some ways that might be kind of a call for help of like, oh, do you need some support in that? Do you want to look at that? I think peer supervision, is really important, to just like run things by people. If you're feeling like, wow, I feel this draw to this client, or I feel triggered by this client, or I find myself extending sessions with the client. So, extending sessions with the client, being available 24/7, starting to feel like in some ways it's your responsibility to save this person. I think anytime there's any kind of untreated addiction, drugs and alcohol, sex addiction, things that create a certain kind of level of unconsciousness and compartmentalization. We see that a lot, obviously, in sex addiction. I think that happens a lot in these exploitive relationships. Again, the studies that I've looked into this really look at it's usually someone who's at a point of crisis. They've gone through a health issue, a divorce, a breakup of a relationship. So at all those times, we're all more vulnerable to all of a sudden getting our needs met in a way that doesn't serve the client.
Okay. Yeah. And I know that was a very big question. So thank you so much for answering it so completely. I think that the follow-up that I have there is, now as somebody who is a mental health professional, how do you support a client who has experienced this violation of their trust and their personhood? And like you said, this is, I think you said work of the soul. And so it's a violation of the spirit. What would you tell therapists about, because I keep thinking that if somebody has experienced this, you have experienced this, what a big step to try and trust again, and to go to another therapist or a counselor or anybody and ask for help when you're really committing to being very vulnerable in a way that's really scary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think if, and I think all of us have experienced clients coming in complaining about a previous therapist. And sometimes that's a therapeutic issue. Sometimes they were getting close to something and it was too scary and they left. So we got to leave. There's often room for that, right? But, as you start to hear about certain ways in which the transference was really kind of not handled appropriately, where this person became larger than life to the client, just really letting them speak that out, have their anger, look at when they started to feel like they started losing the focus on their work and it became more about the therapist or the relationship in a way that wasn't supportive to them. I do think I like the nonverbal modalities, art, music, journaling, right and left hand, the non-dominant hand writing, like things that help people get back in touch with their own truth. And then I think really validating them for how courageous they are to make a go of it again. Like, what a courageous thing to do, to say, I still need help. This thing went awry. I think it's really important not to push them to take action. I think that's very, very tricky because on the one hand, if you hear about a predatory therapist, you want to alert the licensing board. You could call your licensing board, get some advice. In many states, it's about 50% now, is my understanding. Last I looked, it's considered a crime for a therapist to have sexual relations with a patient or a client. And in most of those states, then the attorney general gets involved once there's a complaint made before the licensing board. But what you could do wherever you practice, if you're hearing these stories and you're very worried, because sadly, once a therapist crosses the line, and if they're not held accountable,
they could be more vulnerable to doing this again. My doctor went ahead after I had taken him through 2 lawsuits, front pages of the newspaper in small town. I won both cases. He was already in the process of seducing another patient. And he continued to practice. And there's a long story. I wound up connecting with her husband and all this. And it's part of why I got involved politically to look at the issue. But calling the licensing board and saying, I really need some advice on this. Because it's tricky because, you know, sadly, sometimes when someone reports, they're more vulnerable to suicidal ideation. They're more vulnerable to suicide. So you have to be really respectful. I would say get supervision. There is not one size fits all. And to be honest with you, I don't know if I ever would have taken him to court if the treatment team hadn't said, here's the attorney's name and number. I've got a puppy in my lap, which is why I started. This is Pongo.
Hi, Pongo.
He saw me kind of squirming. Anyway, he was trying to bite me. Anyway, you know, I think where I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, if they hadn't given me the information and said, we really think it's important you take action. And reality is that if I hadn't taken action, they would have reported to the ethics. It was sort of like the jig was up, like he's going to get in trouble anyway. I might as well really follow the treatment plan, get some power, get some money for treatment. I mean, I had a lot of treatment ahead of me. But, you know, very often people don't report. It's too shame-inducing. They feel like they're not going to be trusted. So I think being very sensitive to the client's process around that. And I think it's very different if you're witnessing this outpatient and the person is still functioning versus if they've made a suicide attempt and they're in a hospital. That's a whole different ballgame, right?
Yeah, I can't imagine there would ever be a one size fits all. You know, I think that in the context of, you know, the Me Too movement over the last few years, you know, you can really see for your client kind of that, okay, what is the right and safe thing for you to encourage them to do? I had a question because you had mentioned that they might have reported him themselves.
Yeah.
And so I only know a very little bit about mandatory reporting, but I am curious if for mental health professionals, if you have a client come in and say that they have been abused by another mental health professional, does that fall under mandatory reporting?
I really think that it does, and I apologize that I don't know more.
No, and I'm sure state by state it could be
exactly. That's why I think contacting the licensing board, getting some support, and I think what's tricky again about mandatory reporting is that if it gets back, this is, you know, let me just speak outside what the laws say in the different states, right? But the trickiness is that so if it gets back that you're the one that reported to the ethics committee and there is in fact a review and investigation and then the client hears like, and you haven't told them, that could be perceived as an enormous betrayal of trust, right? Yep. So I think it's very tricky. I did work with a couple of clients over my 20 some years as a therapist who did go before the ethics committee. It was important for them to have that voice. There was an investigation done. One of the therapists had been a colleague of mine and she actually met and talked a little bit about it. But she had to go before and she did not, it was nothing like what happened to me. It was just some murky boundaries that really confused the client, right? But the therapist was really awesome because she said, you know what? I was off. I was starting to get into savior mode. I was crossing boundaries in a way that I was trying to take care of this person and I set myself up. So she was unusual, you know, also I had known her. And then I do know of another client who did report to the ethics committee. And, sadly, there wasn't a lot that was done about that, just as there wasn't with mine. There was a 6-month supervision, mandatory supervision. And then, like I said, he did it again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. What a frustrating experience, you know, to especially the weight of taking all of those actions, making those decisions, doing it from such a vulnerable place, being willing to do that, and then seeing the outcome. And I think that's part of where, that uh, kind of juxtaposition with the Me Too movement of, seeing these powerful people who have behaved in unconscionable ways. And then the outcome is often, it doesn't justify the amount of effort and the amount of trauma that the person who's been victimized is taking on. Um, so
Absolutely.
and I also thought that what you mentioned about, the therapist who had that self-awareness to say, you know what, actually, I was not good about these boundaries.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that wasn't comfortable. It's never comfortable to look at yourself and say, actually, I didn't do the right thing, or I
Right.
was tired, so I took this shortcut. Um,
Right.
but that
That's
seems
integrity.
like, yeah, that's a lot of integrity. And that sounds like one of those things that also very much falls under consciously and deliberately doing your own work, so that you are taking a look at yourself. Who am I? Where am I at? And how does that impact the clients that I have?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think just continuing to be in support, get support, support others, be in the exploration of how to continue to create situations that are empowering for our clients and giving them back the power. And I think you and I talked about this, is that we are in positions of enormous power, even if we think we're giving the power back, right? Even if we do everything we can to keep putting it back in their lap, they need within their psyche, depending upon what level of crisis and where they are developmentally, they need to see us as the authorities to some degree. We need to be an anchor. So we can never underestimate how powerful we are, even if we feel like we don't seize power.
Yeah.
The container itself is so powerful, and it can be quite intoxicating because, again, we're dealing with soul work. It's and there's a lot of mystery in that, and there's powerful transformational energies that are at play, and sometimes they can really be sexualized. And just being aware of what gets activated in us, and how are we working with the client, and how do we keep sending them back to their life,
Yeah.
not more and more in ours. I mean, even if it means 2 sessions a week, I mean, sometimes people need that. But yeah, I think none of this is black and white. It's very human. I just hope there can be much more conversation, just as there is in the society at large because of the Me Too movement, about power differentials and abuse that takes place in the university setting by professors, or in the medical center by doctors or producers, right? All those things. So all those aspects. So just happy to be part of the conversation, and happy to be on the other side of it now. I'm glad to be 60.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again so much for sharing your story. Just a reminder to everyone, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if you have any questions at all, please feel free to drop them in the chat. You can click the raise hand button. You can hit Q&A. Carrie Ishee is here to answer your questions, so don't be shy. And I have questions for days, so I'm going to keep firing in while we wait for other folks to ask some. Was there ever a point where, because you're also a therapist, was there ever, not ever a point, but was there a point where that path forward became extremely clear to you, after going through all of this, after looking, at an experience in a psychiatric hospital in the 80s is not the softest experience by any means. How did you decide, or how did you know that you still wanted to press forward with that?
You mean with writing the book?
No, with becoming a therapist, and all of the effort
Sure.
that has come from still wanting to inhabit this role that,
Right.
your experience with was very, very different than the ideal one, but which I'm super minimizing by saying that. But how did you know that that was still a path you wanted to take?
Yeah. Well, I think just looking at sort of the arc of my whole journey is that, and again, this is not to dismiss his responsibility for crossing boundaries, but I think that part of what the dynamic was that got set up is I was so hungry to learn about the field. I was so interested. I was so curious. I felt like I had a future in the healing arts in some ways. I had originally been thinking about medical school, and I'm glad I didn't take that path. But so I had that in my soul as a seed anyway, which I think is probably what then part of why he found me very attractive, as I was really so intrigued about all the work and thought it was just amazing, right? So that was there. And then of course I was devastated when I had gotten in, and this is bizarre too, I'd gotten accepted into this doctoral program in clinical psychology with his son. So I was in a program of 12, I guess there were 13 of us, and 2 of us were me and him. And so it was another way in which I just had to keep the secret. I didn't want him to get in trouble. I didn't want my colleagues to know. So, but I was getting this fellowship in behavioral medicine, which I was fascinated by, but at the same time not functioning very well about, right? So I had already created this trajectory of wanting to do the work. And then after that, I felt so damaged and I was so jaded about it. I was like, this doesn't work. People are sick. Therapists are sicker than the patients. I mean, all of this really, really pushing away. And the bottom line is, I think the pushing away was good because I wasn't ready to be a therapist. Oh my gosh, I was so broken. But I wound up then becoming, for a period of time, an interior decorator, and I'm a singer. I was doing gigs and I was doing all this creative stuff, partly to heal myself. But when I would go and try to sell draperies, before I knew it, I was in a deep conversation with the person about their marriage.
Yeah.
I think I'm supposed to work, talk about interior design. It was like a different kind of interior design. So it was like I really couldn't stay away from it. So it was another 13 years or so before I got back into it. And at that point, as an art therapist, as opposed to a psychologist, which was much more cerebral, very interesting, but much more cerebral. Yeah, and then I was ambivalent for a while. I mean, I'd finished my degree and got my first license, and it took me a while to sit down and get my independent license because I was like, do I really want to do this?
Mhm.
And I think it just took healing and growing up and becoming a mother and recognizing too, as an art therapist, that I could rely on the art so often to guide the process, refer people back to the art. And that felt really powerful because I knew how powerful that was for me
Yeah.
in reclaiming the authority. And so people that work with me now, not everybody does art, but many people come to me because I use art. And
Yeah.
so that's, I think that's allowed me to find a path into doing the work that resonates with my own journey. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. This a friend of mine is on the call. Wow, Viktor Frankl here. Let me just say, shout out to Nelson. This is awesome. Nelson and I did a project in graduate school on Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And that's the story. And I found that book when I was in the psychiatric hospital. It basically like fell off it was sort of like I was looking at Freud. I'm like, whoa. And then it like popped out at me. And whether it physically popped out or energetically, I don't remember it. All of a sudden it was like, oh my God, Viktor Frankl. And that's the story of like, once you've lost everything, you can still choose what meaning you're going to make of an experience. So Viktor Frankl was a huge light figure. And at Southwestern College, we access light figures, someone who portrayed a certain kind of consciousness that we can use for guidance. Thank you, Nelson. That's wild.
I have a question. Oh, so sorry.
Go ahead.
I have a question from Anne, and they're saying it gets harder and harder to find a therapist the longer and more seasoned one becomes in their profession. Do you have any tips or thoughts on finding a therapist when you are a little bit more seasoned?
Oh, wow. I think it so depends upon what resonates with you, like right now I'm doing a shamanic apprenticeship. So I'm working with someone who's a master's level therapist, but also a shaman. And I'm really doing it for my own edification, but also just my own support to be in a circle of people doing this work. So that appealed to me
So I got to, focus on someone that has training in an area that helps me feel like I'm expanding personally and professionally. So I think deciding where you want to grow, maybe you're a singer and you need to be singing, and go see a music therapist, or someone who, they don't have to be credentialed as a music therapist, but knows how to use song and vibration. So I think my sense is, and again, this is just coming from my view, is that find where you feel like you want to grow and see what modality that matches, and then start to see who offers that. That's
Awesome. Thanks so
that's
much
what
for that. That makes a lot of sense. I think you're also a life coach. So you are
Yeah.
very well positioned to say, okay, there's healing from trauma, and then there's what comes next. And
Yes.
that seems like a universal experience, regardless of your profession, that there will be things that you have to heal from, and then there will be the next step. And then there will be things again that you have to heal from, and then there will again be the next step. And that kind of focus on, you know, uh, remembering that the outcome doesn't always have to be the same. Even with Persephone, the first time that she was taken down to the underworld, she didn't have any control. It was very dark. She was very frightened. She didn't know the rules. I don't think we have time to talk about the pomegranate, but she didn't know the rules. And so she couldn't really move around as herself. And then progressed further through the myth to the point where she is the goddess of spring, and she can come and go from the underworld, and she can help people leave the underworld as well.
Right. Into their own spring, essentially, right? And
Yeah.
trusting the cycles of that, because no matter how much work we do on ourselves, we're going to have life kick our butts at times, where before we know it, we're like, wait a second, I'm not feeling so grounded, so connected to myself. What is it that I need? And I think it's important for us to be humble that way, that we keep growing, we keep going through these cycles. And I also think I have to say something about the life coaching piece too, though, that I would like to see there be more life coaching integrated into therapy training programs, because I do think it's very powerful to, from the beginning, talk about, and you don't have to have training to do this, but I think it's a good conceptualization. Like, let's just assume you're going to get through this hardship and this wound. Do you have a sense of what it is that you want to do once you're on the other side of this? Now, some people won't, and so then you don't push there. But some people are like, yeah, this is what I want to be doing. And often that's part of what the crisis is, not just their childhood trauma, but they're off track. They're doing what their dad wanted them to do 20 years later, and really they're an artist, they're not a doctor or whatever, so I think looking at all of this holistically, and you can get that kind of training in a lot of different ways, but like, what's our purpose, what's our, what are we here for? And people are at different levels of being able to converse about that. I mean, obviously, if you're in a lot of crisis, it's usually just like, this just sucks, I want to feel better, and that's where they are, and that's where you meet them.
That's terrific. I especially the piece of meeting people where they are, and having that additional understanding to say, okay, you're not just here, you're also here, and here's how we can help put those together and move forward. We just have 2 minutes left, so I wanted to again just remind folks that you can learn more about Carrie and about Seduced into Darkness at carrieishee.com. There's a link in the chat if you want to click on that. You can also learn more about Integrative Life Center and the programs that they offer at integrativelifecenter.com or integrativelifenetwork.com. And as you've seen, this has been a terrific conversation, and you can certainly expect more terrific conversations from ILC and the content they sponsor. Carrie, before we sign off, is there anything that you want to make sure that the audience or me or anyone know beforehand?
I just would say, I mean, inspiration to keep becoming the person that you want to be. Because if you're walking in your truth and yourself, accessing as much self with a capital S, then the work becomes play, and it's much more fun, and you can trust the process. But I think, it really comes from the inside out. We keep working on ourselves. We keep playing. We keep having fun, creating beauty. And that I'd like to, move away from that idea of the burnt out, overburdened therapist into, people really in their power, being inspired, sharing. And there are a lot of those folks out there. And it's just amazing. I wish I had more time, and I'd like to make more time to just associate with my colleagues. And this has been amazing. And ILC has been amazing. I sent a client there not long ago, and know the folks there. A very holistic model, right? Very holistic, wonderful evolution. So hopefully there'll be more of that available to folks.
Fantastic. Thank you again so much for being vulnerable, for sharing your story with us today and with everyone else through your book. Thank you to everybody who attended today. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful weekend. Thanks so much, Carrie. I really look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Thank you, Ani. All right. Thanks so much, folks. Thank you.